Recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And following on the comments from the member from Kamloops North, I think it is a really important conversation that we need to be having about the clauses in Bill 45, miscellaneous statutes, that are specifically around definitions around encampments. I have very specific concerns about the first two clauses of Bill 45. The proposed additions to the Vancouver Charter and Community Charter are troubling. At first glance, these clauses appear to be clarifying definitions for the courts. The definition that describes a typical shelter space. However, the definition provided describes less than the bare minimum for shelter. It fails to recognize the accessibility of shelters and the barriers that people face in accessing these types of spaces. These clauses create a definition for what constitutes reasonably available shelter, quote, for the purposes of enforcing a bylaw against a person who is sheltering at an encampment while homeless. The definition does not accommodate nuance nor accessibility, yet if passed, would be the de jure definition used in court decisions around decampment injunctions. This is concerning, as justices would no longer be able to use the wealth of precedents nor nuanced judgment when deciding on if an injunction should be granted to a city. Years of court cases supported by countless hours of personal testimony and affidavits have created a definition of, quote, reasonably accessible shelter that is used in the courts. Yet this definition, proposed by the BC government, proposed by the BC NDP, would scrap this precedent to make it easier for municipalities to get granted injunctions for decampments. Lawyers, advocates, law professors, and community members are worried about the impacts this legislation will have on unhoused and precariously housed residents. In a Vancouver Sun article published last week, Laurie Colbert and Dan Fumano wrote about the housing affordability crisis and explained that even high-income earners are at risk of eviction. Quote, regardless of incomes, the fallout from many of these evictions is horrendous. First United data show 45% of Indigenous tenants could not immediately find a new home after being evicted. And that was also true for a quarter of non-Indigenous people. Some said they were forced to live in cars, trucks, or trailers, sometimes with family members, including children, seniors, and people with disabilities. All of us in our communities and our constituencies are hearing the stories of people who are losing housing. People of every age, of every background in this province are being evicted from housing. And the data shows 25% of non-Indigenous and 45% of Indigenous people cannot find housing when that happens. This is a catastrophe. Instead of investing in building immediately available non-market housing, this government is passing legislation that will make it easier to decamp people from the shelters that they find. Astonishing. In our ridings, across the province, streets are lined with RVs, camper vans, cars that serve as people's homes. Many of these people would be classified as precariously housed. There was a UVic student who could not find affordable housing, yet the university would not allow students like him to park overnight on campus. Many people in this province are just steps away, moments away from being unhoused. That may be one tow, one fine away from losing their home, the vehicle that they are living in, or being deprived of their already eroded sense of security. Enforcement of bylaws amounts to a large amount of public funds being used against marginalized people, Indigenous, Black, people of color, queer and trans people, those with mental health challenges, those living with addictions, and people with disabilities, all of whom are more likely to experience housing insecurity. 6 years ago in Cowichan, there were 0 adults with developmental disabilities who were homeless in our region. Today there are 11 adults with developmental disabilities with nowhere to live. 11. There used to be 0. Overlapping histories of trauma and violence compound the fears and risks that people experience when they are unhoused. Unmet healthcare needs, the housing affordability crisis, the drug poisoning crisis, unresolved trauma, and the extraordinary cost of living have compounded and accelerated housing insecurity in this province. In the 2023 homeless count in Greater Vancouver, almost 5,000 people were identified as experiencing homelessness, a 32% increase from 2020. Of these 4,821 people, 33% identified as Indigenous. Over 2/3 of Indigenous respondents had lived or had generational experience of residential schools. Indigenous people are disproportionately represented among unhoused populations. Many are homeless on their own lands and faced with punitive measures, street sweeps, injunctions, decampments. In April of this year, we saw the devastating impacts of street sweeps. Community members, advocates, and lawyers have described the Hastings decampment in the spring as violent and dehumanizing. Belongings were scrapped and destroyed. People were displaced with nowhere to go. And many returned to the streets, but without tents or any form of shelter. The cascading effects of displacement are immense. Displacements result in the loss of belongings and survival equipment. They cause a further fracturing of trust in government. Although available shelter spaces were cited during this decampment, the reality is these spaces did not exist. And the spaces that were available were among some of the most unsafe SROs in the area. Amidst a plethora of intersecting crises, the housing affordability crisis, toxic drug crisis, climate crisis, the government has a responsibility to care for all citizens. Despite this obligation, we've seen a heartbreaking pattern of displacement, death, and ongoing violation of basic human rights. This government has failed to meet people's most basic needs. It's not the fault of the people. It's the failure of their government. Its policy choices and its investment choices. It is not natural or inevitable to have homeless people in our society. Our government, our governments, for decades have made policy choices and have made investment choices that have gotten us to exactly here. Time and time again, they have chosen to allow people to suffer from their poor policy decisions. The definition of, quote, reasonably available shelter space is insufficient and inadequate. It fails to recognize the reasons why people may choose to shelter on the street. People have expressed time and time again why they feel unsafe in particular shelter spaces. People often have to leave their belongings and survival equipment in exchange for a night in a shelter. Women experience violence at high rates in shelter spaces and have little to no control as to who they have to sleep next to. The definition of, quote, reasonably available shelter space does not account for a nuance of factors. The personal barriers someone may face in accessing a designated shelter space include shelters with restriction to a single sex, people with intimate partners forced to split with their partners if the shelter spaces cannot accommodate couples, and even same-sex couples experience this split in shelter spaces. Shelters with restrictions on pets. People with pets or companion animals would be unable to be accommodated in these spaces. I've seen this in the Cowichan Valley. Individuals were forced to make the difficult decision of living outside because of the lack of available pet-friendly shelter spaces. Shelters with adequate available storage space. Everyone who shelters outdoors has belongings, including supplies to provide basic protection from the elements, tents, sleeping bags, warm clothing. All shelters have restrictions on the amount of personal items someone can bring in with them. Many have a maximum of a backpack. Where are their personal belongings supposed to be stored? The need for daytime shelter. If people have lost their belongings to enter an overnight shelter, they would be left with no survival equipment during the day. Many shelters kick people out in the morning and provide no guarantee for those people to have a space to stay again in the evening. Accessibility of the shelter. Many shelters are not accessible for people with physical disabilities. People have cited the loss of their mobility devices or the inability to stay in a shelter due to stairs, narrow doorways, or other dimensions of physical accessibility. Shelters with substance use prohibitions and curfews. These restrictions pose barriers for people with addictions. If they're unable to use substances indoors and go elsewhere to consume, they may not be admitted back in the shelter. On the other side, many people with a history of substance use have expressed that they do not want to be in a, quote, wet shelter. They do not want to be surrounded by other people using substances and therefore require access to a dry shelter. One-strike policies. Many people living on the street have complex, overlapping mental health issues, have experienced trauma. These people would inevitably be labeled as having behavioral problems in shelter spaces. Someone may experience an episode that gets them kicked out or banned from returning to shelter spaces. If someone is banned, then they would have no real access to the reasonably available shelter space. Shelters with crowded and congregate sleeping. Doors without locks are not suitable for people who have gone through trauma. The courts have heard from survivors of domestic abuse and residential school survivors. They share that they can't sleep in many shelters because the spaces replicate the conditions in which they experienced traumatizing events. Institutional barriers include governments, cities, and social service agencies that purport to provide up-to-date information on shelter availability are frequently inaccurate. People working for encampment residents have tried to sue these websites. They have found the information to be totally inaccurate. Websites may advertise bed availability. The advocate will call and be informed that the shelter has no space. The information is highly unreliable, yet governments have gone to court with this information. Relying on data that is not accurate is not a good way to make public policy. This bill mentions nothing about the indigenous and colonial context. The courts have just begun to recognize these in court injunctions. The ongoing colonial violence and dispossession of land and homes, combined with personal and community violence and trauma, have contributed to the large portion of Indigenous and racialized people experiencing homelessness. All of these factors have constitutional implications. It has been proven throughout case law that residents of encampments have constitutional rights which need to be taken into account when judges decide on decampment injunctions. As a premise, it's condescending, dehumanizing, and frankly absurd to suggest that people need a court order to force them to move into a shelter. If it is in fact accessible and meets their needs, they will move there. No one wants to sleep on the street. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing stated, quote, "While encampments are not a solution to homelessness, it is critical that governments uphold the basic human rights and dignity of encampment residents while they wait for adequate, affordable housing solutions that meet their needs. The principles outlined in this protocol are based on international human rights law and the recognition that encampment residents are rights holders and experts in their own lives." Encampment residents are human beings, and encampment residents deserve dignity. This definition of shelter sets a lower standard than what the courts have. In March of this year, the Ministry of Housing released a report addressing the housing conditions in the downtown East Side. In quote, "Supporting the Downtown East Side Provincial Partnership Plan working document," the ministry states, quote, "We learned from the Vancouver decampments of Oppenheimer Park in 2020 and Strathcona Park in 2021 how best practices resulted in transitions to stable housing for the majority of those sheltering and real-time wraparound health and social supports available throughout the process. There is acknowledgement that some people may not transition to indoor options or may be challenged to sustain housing due to health, mental health, or substance use issues, or individual barriers or circumstances. As such, there is a need to ensure that parks or other outdoor shelter options where shelter is permitted overnight are known to people who are experiencing homelessness in alignment with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms." We cannot just keep pushing people out of sight. We cannot continue to strip people of autonomy and dignity and the right to safety. Why is the bar set so low with this definition of shelter? In the regional municipality of Waterloo versus Persons Unknown and to be ascertained in the Ontario Supreme Court, Justice M.J. Valent states, quote, "It is simply not a matter of counting the number of spaces. To be of any real value to the homeless population, the spaces must meet their diverse needs, or in other words, the spaces must be truly accessible. If the available spaces are impractical for homeless individuals, either because the shelters do not accommodate couples or are unable to provide required services, impose rules that cannot be followed due to addictions, or cannot accommodate mental or physical disability, they are not low barrier and accessible to the individuals that they are meant to serve. Although not binding on me, I adopt and follow the decisions of the British Columbia Supreme Court in Chance, Prince George City versus Stewart, 2021, and Bamberger, all of which hold that in order for the shelter spaces to be truly available, they must in fact be low barrier or accessible to accommodate the homeless population. We received the following statement from a law advocate. Quote, "The government is trying to legislate over several years of court decisions to set a much lower standard of when people can be subject to an injunction merely because they are homeless. Again, an injunction means arrest, jail, and loss of all of their possessions. In doing so, they are ignoring the very well-established evidence that our broken shelter system is not accessible for people for a wide variety of reasons. That people are forced to live in parks because shelters are A, almost always full, B, not accessible to and don't meet the needs of certain people for many clear reasons that the courts have recognized and understood. It is not clear why the government hasn't read these cases or taken them into account, but the public needs to understand that there is very clear evidence. This law is going to lead to people losing their homes, health, dignity, and even lives. This law is going to contribute to people losing their homes, health, dignity, and even their lives. We need to create solutions, not continually try to push the problems that are a result of decades of government policy and a lack of investment in affordable housing out of sight. The failure is not of the people who don't have a place to live. The failure is of multiple governments choosing these outcomes. We are not here by accident. We do not get out of here by making laws that punish people who are suffering because they're homeless or because they are using drugs. But this is an astonishing session of the legislature, because that is the legislation that is being pushed through this House right now. We are punishing the most marginalized people in our province. We have a government that is saying, we would like you to get out of sight, please. We don't want to see you anymore. Make yourselves more invisible. That is the legislation that is being passed in this House. There are solutions. We have the Village Project in Duncan, a Herculean effort of the mayor of Duncan, of Cowichan Housing Society, continually having to go right to the brink with BC Housing to get funding, to continue to house dozens of people successfully, with dignity, with health care, with community, with belonging, all of the things that people need to be well. And yet, it has been nothing but resistance from the government. $1 million, you can create 40 housing units for people. And for $1 million a year, those people can have the services they need to be well. Those are policy choices. Those are investments that this government could choose to make everywhere, in every community in BC. And it's less to house 40 people than to leave them homeless. But the choices keep being made. There are so many housing bills up for debate this week. I want to draw attention to the juxtaposition. This government has put forward plans for creating housing in the long term, yet continue to push unhoused people further to the margins. In the case of Bambridger versus Vancouver, the Board of Parks and Recreation, Justice Kirchner determined that, quote, available shelter must mean the genuine ability to access the space. A shelter's suitability must take into account an individual's specific needs, yet in this legislation, shelter is one size fits all. There is no reference to beds or sleep, but simply the ability to stay overnight. This is not what I had anticipated from this government. Well, in one house, there's a bill that is helping people who already have enormous wealth see significant increases to their wealth. You're a homeowner in British Columbia, Bill 44, you're going to see a massive increase to the value of your property and your wealth. In another house, here we are, figuring out how to make homeless people less of a problem. This does not solve the crisis that we are in. This does not give the dignity that every human being in this province deserves to have. This does not meet the basic human right for people to have a place to live. We are an outlier as a nation, allowing for this kind of outcome, allowing for thousands and thousands upon thousands of people to have to live without shelter. It is a complete failure. And we should be ashamed, and we should be treating it like the emergency that it is. I'd like to see a government that is committed to ensuring that everybody in this province has access to housing. Not that we change the definition of what shelter is so that we can more easily move them along so we don't have to see them. With that, Honourable Speaker, thank you.